Hey everybody, I'm Jack Rita. I'm a game designer with Future Pastimes, and we're reading Dune. We are at a pivotal chapter that marks the end of Book 1, which is roughly about 1/3 of the way into the book. And so in this scene, Paul and Lady Jessica are hiding in a still tent, and it was part of the package of goodies that Dr. Yui left them in the ornithopter, along with a bunch of other Fremen-made supplies to help one survive in the desert. And we realized that they have been secreted to this location by Duncan Idaho, who scooped them up immediately after the previous chapter where they had overcome their Harkonnen captors. So Duncan lands an ornithopter right at their position, sent there by Dr. Yui. And Lady Jessica is like, oh no, it's an ornithopter, but Paul can tell by the way it's flying and the way it lands, that's Duncan Idaho. And so he's like, yeah, there's Harkonnen coming, there's a sandworm coming, let's get out of here. So he takes him to another location, and then he goes off to find Dr. Kynes and get some next steps. And Paul is thinking through their predicament, and his Mentat training is really kicked into overdrive. Thufir and the Duke were training Paul as a Mentat because he showed signs of having a really good calculating mind. So he was getting some extra training subversively, and earlier in one of the earlier chapters, they let him know that they've been doing this, and they say, if you want to go any further down this path, it's got to be by your choice. And he's like, yeah, that sounds great. But he's wheels in his head are really turning. And we find out later on in this chapter why that is. But he's starting to see things and make connections. He realizes that the Fremen have been bribing the Guild so that there's no weather control on Arrakis, and there's no satellites spying on what is done, which is probably something that happens on other worlds with regularity. And he's kind of amazed that just how slow his mother is at piecing together the stuff. Like, for instance, they've got this note, and Paul knows that it's Dr. Yui, and he can tell by the handwriting it's Dr. Yui, although it's not signed, but it's a bit of a confession, an apology of sorts. And Jessica's like, yeah, it must be Dr. Yui. And she's like, yeah, I think it's because they must have had his wife. And Paul is like, I figured all this out already. And he's just kind of like, ugh, I'm not sure why she hasn't picked up on all of this yet. And then he realizes he's got to let her know that the Duke is dead, because at that point he just knows. He knows that his father is dead. And he's like, I got to give her time to grieve, because we are not going to have time later on. And he's beating himself up a little bit because he's not grieving. He's like, oh, I need to mourn my father, but right now it's just another piece of data that is entered into my head to be cataloged and checked for its usefulness. And so as he's going through that, and he's listening to his mom, mourn the death of the Duke, and he's told her the Duke's last message, which was, if anything happens to me, you let Lady Jessica know that I never suspected she was the traitor. I trusted her completely, and I wanted her to make sure that she knew that. So she's in anguish about that. And I go, yeah. And his one regret was that he didn't make her his Duchess. And so, yeah, she's feeling the pain there, and he's listening to her. But then he's starting to experience prescience. He's starting to realize that he's getting data from memories that are not his own, and he's seeing paths into the future with clarity and certainty. And he's starting to figure out why that is, and it has to do with the Bene Gesserit training that he received from his mother, but also because of his heritage and this whole plan to create the Kwisatz Haderach. And he's realizing that he is the fruit of those labors, but not quite the way anyone expected. And he sees that he is definitely a freak, and he's like, what can a freak like me do? And at first he's like, well, we could probably take refuge with the Guild. They would have use for a freak of my skills. But he's like, no, that's not the thing. It's because the thing that has really kicked my Mentat abilities into overdrive and is giving me all of this other insight is the spice. And he realizes that the spice has really just amplified everything about him. And it's the reason why he is not just the Kwisatz Haderach, but he's something unexpected. He's a completely different version of what the Bene Gesserit have been spending generations trying to create. Because Arrakis, you're getting a low-dose hit of spice everywhere on Arrakis, and he's been getting it, and it's really, it's the combination of all these things, and he calls his mother out on it. He's kind of furious about this at this point because she has done this to him. And she tries to be like, look, it's, your heritage is part of your father. And at one point, she's like, we've got to worry about the Harkonnens. And Paul is like, here's the deal. We're Harkonnens. And because he has figured out that they have Harkonnen heritage. And she's like, what in the world are you talking about? And he's like, you are the Baron's daughter. And he knows it. He just knows that that's true. And she, with her Bene Gesserit training, realizes that Paul is absolutely telling the truth. And she's like, yep, that tracks. The Bene Gesserit, the society has been manipulating the bloodlines, and that's the thing that has clearly led to this right now. And so Paul he's thinking about his paths forward, and he's seeing there's all these things that he could do. And one of the paths, and one of the most clearly lit paths, has to do with seeking sanctuary with the Fremen. But that is very likely to lead to jihad, which will be an unimaginable number of deaths and destruction. But he's not really getting the full implications of what the jihad will mean, but he just knows that it's going to have to do with cultivating desert power, which was what his father was going to try to do in Arrakis, which the Harkonnens could never really do. And the key to that is the Fremen. And because the Fremen have been positioned by the Bene Gesserit generations past through the Missionaria Protectiva, they've got this whole religious angle, this whole prophecy about a savior. And Paul realizes they're going to slip right into that. They're going to call me Muad'Dib, which is the one who points the way. And so he has his resolve. He's like, we're going to go and seek shelter with the Fremen, even though that is going to cause problems, very likely too. But he's like, that's the decision. And then he realizes, okay, I can check that off the list now, and now I can mourn. And then he starts to cry. So that's where this chapter ends. It's a powerful chapter because a lot of things click into place, and it's really an important first step for what I consider the sort of mysticism of Dune, which we've only been dancing around up to this point, but it's going to become much more front and center as we move forward and we get into what it means for Paul to be the Kwisatz Haderach, what it means for him to really take the spice and make it a part of his whole process, and how that affects his prescience. So we're getting teed up with it in this chapter, and Herbert is fairly subtle with a lot of this. So my first time reading through it, I kind of glossed over it. I didn't really take a lot of it away. It was not until after I've read this a couple of times that I realized what is happening in this chapter and how big of a lead-up point it is, because it's clicking a lot of things into place, and it's teeing us up for what is going to come moving forward. And a lot of revelations in here. The fact that the Baron is Lady Jessica's father, that's a big deal. And Paul tells Lady Jessica he knows that she's pregnant with his sister, and she's a little bit stunned by that because she's definitely not showing. She only barely was able to detect that fact using her own Bene Gesserit training. But he doesn't know that because he can see it. He's not using his Bene Gesserit skills of observation. It has to do with the prescience. He knows that this is happening and he's seeing it. So in terms of adaptations, again, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. What's interesting about the Villeneuve version of this is that, first of all, it goes a little bit out of order. In the movie, we see them escape the ornithopter where the Harkonnens were, and they disappear into a different section of the deep desert there. They're in the still tent. So a lot of this happened, but they have not been rescued by Duncan, Idaho yet. That happens afterward. And it's not a big deal. I think, we don't see Duncan in this chapter in the book. We are remembering what has happened through Paul's POV. But there's more of a dramatic scene that happens in the movie. And it's a good scene, I think, because part of it is everybody at the same time is realizing that Paul is now the Duke. And you can see it on all of their faces, it's really well done. The other thing is that in the adaptation, the whole jihad part is what really is the main focus of the prescient vision and Paul's reaction in this particular scene in the movie. And Villeneuve really plays into the fact that it's been triggered by the spice. You can see the particles of spice floating around in the tent, and he realizes he's having a physical reaction to it as well. So I think it does a better job of helping the audience to figure out that that's what's going on. They didn't really play into Paul as a mentat at all in the movie. They didn't mention that. And they don't really get into that whole analysis element on there. And the whole part where he tells his mother that he knows that she's pregnant is much earlier in the movie. It happens after the harvester is eaten by the sandworm when they're out there on the ornithopter with Liette. After that, they in the movie they play up Paul having a strong reaction to the spice, which does not really happen in the book at all. So they've taken that, they've kind of injected that scene into the movie, and they have a little scene where Dr. Yui is examining Paul, and he's explaining to the audience that it's a psychotropic drug, among other things. And Paul realizes, and he confesses to his mom that he had some kind of prescient vision, and then he knows that she's pregnant. And so they lay the seeds for that in the movie in that way, but this is where it really happens in the book. In the Lynch movie, they get into a lot more of the thinking about what's going on here, especially because they're doing the inner dialogue, the thoughts, as well as a kind of whispered voiceover. But you have that whole element of Paul realizing that the sleeper has awakened, although they don't really explain that too much in the Lynch movie. A little bit. It's more about it's the spice that has done it, and less about his heritage and his training and whatnot. But it is still related to him being the Kwisatz Haderach. So they did a pretty decent job with that. And again, the miniseries, pretty close, fairly faithful, some deviations as well. Not as powerful. It wasn't as impactful, I think, in the miniseries, although not a bad job. The cast does a pretty admirable job with that, and the writing was pretty decent as well. But with the miniseries, they're stretching it out, so sometimes stuff doesn't have the same impact that it does, like with the Villeneuve movie, where they did compress it. So again, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but overall, everyone adapted this scene and got the high points and the important elements in there. The fact that Paul realizes that he's something more. He's not a normal person. He's buying into the fact, yes, I'm the Kwisatz Haderach. But we see here in the book in particular that he realizes not the Kwisatz Haderach in any way that anyone had imagined. And he realizes a lot of that is because he is early. He realizes he was not supposed to be the Kwisatz Haderach. Had he been a daughter bred to a Harkonnen heir, that would have been the Kwisatz Haderach, and it would have been a version of it more in line with what the Bene Gesserit were predicting and hoping for, and probably they would have had more luck controlling that Kwisatz. But Paul realizes he's a kind of a different strain of it, and it is because of the training and the spice. That combination of things has really kind of put him off the rails a little bit. So let me know your thoughts on this chapter. If you're reading along, your views on any of the adaptations, what you liked or didn't like about those, and then any questions about stuff. This is I think our first chapter, where we're going to start to move into territory where questions are going to start coming up a little bit more, because we're going to get into that mysticism. So Herbert's going to be writing a lot about a lot of weird prescience elements, and that he does, when he wants to, he does a really good job with some poetic language as well, which we will see in a lot of these chapters as he's describing things that are on purpose supposed to be hard to describe. But he does a really good job with it. But in some areas, it feels a little ambiguous. So, like I said, if the questions will come, you'll get my take on it, which may not be 100% accurate either, but it's what I have pulled out of my understanding of Dune as I've read through it multiple times. That's it, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll get into Book 2 of Dune in the next Let's Read Dune video.